All right, so continuing on with the October 2019 reading section, we're now on passage 3. We know that passage 3 is always a natural science piece. Sometimes those will have graphs, but it doesn't look like this one does. So we wouldn't necessarily want to save this one to be an eject cord. We would want to go ahead and do it. It was written in 2010. Again, we'll read this intro information. Written in 2010, and it's called If Not for Plants, Could Rivers Bend? So we're going to learn about how plants affect the flow of rivers or maybe riverbeds. So let's go ahead and start diagnosing our questions. Question number 22, the primary purpose. Okay, so purpose, function, or main idea, but it's of the entire passage, so we know that that is main idea. Question 23, which statement best describes? So this sounds like it's going to be a content and characterization question. We need to see if it has a, best describes the reasoning that they use to reach their main conclusion. So because of this main conclusion, that's interesting. It becomes a main conclusion question, which is a main idea, primary purpose. So that's interesting how sometimes things can look a certain way, but then when we get deeper into it, we realize that it's asking about a bigger chunk. So main idea, primary purpose. It does not have a COE follow-up. This COE here is a standalone. So we'll navigate that when it's time to answer it. We know the answers will be in these 4 lines, so we don't need to keep our eye out for anything as we read. Question number 25, strongly suggest. So I already know it's an inference. I don't need to know what it's asking yet. I'm going to check for a COE follow-up. It has one, so I'm not going to spend too much time pre-reading the question because I know it is an inference. Question 27 is a word in context as used in line blank. This word most nearly means. So let's go ahead and circle the word emerge in line 41 so that we can remember to stop and look at that as we are reading. All right, number 28, main function, and we're asking about a paragraph, and we have an is to, so very clear purpose function question. Let's go to lines 59 through 65 and bracket those. 59 through 65. So this paragraph right here, we're going to stop and talk about. The author most likely, so that feels like an inference question. It does not have a COE follow-up, so let's see what it's asking. He most likely discusses the research conducted at the University of Minnesota too. So, okay, look, now we have what appeared at first to be a inference and suggestion question because it's most likely, but it's talking about the author and why he does something. So this isn't going to be an inference question now that we've read a little bit deeper. It's what type of question? Purpose function. And we're looking at the research conducted at the University of Minnesota. It doesn't give us line numbers, but we know it's going to be somewhere between 65 and 87. So when we go back to answer the question, we know that we can look there. All right, question number 30 is a word in context. Line 87, the word critical. So we'll go ahead and circle that. And then question 31, which finding about rivers from the end of the Permian period, if true, would best support Davies and Gibling's argument? So this is a standard inference and suggestion question. It does not have a COE follow-up because it's the last question in the piece. So we're looking for a finding about the rivers from the end of the Permian period that would support his argument. So we need to find what his argument is, first of all. Rivers at the end of the Permian period and something that would agree with that. Okay, so this is kind of going to be if this is true, would it support or would it disagree? And we're going to look for the one that supports. All right, so let's go to the piece. We know that we have 2 main idea questions, so we can't really prepare for those. We can't necessarily prepare for the COE question or the COE pair. We'll stop at this word in context and talk about it. We'll stop after the 11th paragraph and decide what its function within the piece as a whole is. When we see this research conducted at University of Minnesota, we'll mark it. And then again, that word in context in line 87. So let's take a look. All right, for decades, the Canadian geologist Martin Gibling has been intrigued by the tough-to-prove hypothesis that land plants created the shape of modern rivers hundreds of years ago. Plant roots reinforced the ground, the thinking goes, creating stable banks that funneled what once were wide, shallow water flows into narrower and deeper channels. By extension, that set the stage for lots of significant Earth history events, including the rise of human civilization in modern river basins so many millennia later. Now, Gibling and postdoctoral scientist Neil Davies, both at Dalhousie University, have strengthened this case. When the pair compared a much improved plant fossil record with the evidence of how rivers changed very long ago, the transitions matched up. As soon as the plants got a foothold on land and rooted vegetation started, that changed the landscape. Basically, plants engineered that landscape as they evolved. Back in Cambrian period, which ended some 500 million years ago, the geological record indicates that rivers were very shallow but wide things, almost floods that allowed rainwater to wash from largely barren solid ground to sea. Deposits left behind were preserved as sheets of coarse grains, some of which suggest that these rivers were 1,000 or more times as wide as they were deep. There is probably nowhere on Earth where rivers formed the way they did before vegetation, Gibling says. But at the time separating the Silurian and Devonian periods, some 420 million years ago, the picture found in preserved sedimentary rock changes. The blankets of unconsolidated sediment found in earlier river deposits appear less frequently. It happens just as evidence of land vegetation with root systems also expands in the rock record. In addition, more complex and diverse river remains emerge, including some traces of mud, probably due to the enhanced chemical weathering. So when I see this word emerge, I think of like shows up, like we start noticing it, it's kind of coming to the surface. All right, smaller size sand grains and samples of organic remains. Significantly, shapes shift too. Organized deposits become visible in the remains of highly sinuous single-thread channels. Evidence of lateral accretion, the digging away of material at the outer bends of a river, and the simultaneous deposition of materials at the inner bends is more abundant. There is also variation that appears to be related to the local climate during the times that the rivers flowed. Before plants evolved, it didn't matter if a river was in a polar region, a temperate region, or an arid region. The rivers looked the same. Later, you find differences, said Davies, who devoted 2.5 years to this project. So now we have a purpose function paragraph. Using funding from the Canadian government, Davies and Gibling reviewed 144 published reports describing river sediment preserved in the rock record, dating from the Cambrian to the Devonian, to build their case. They visited 34 spots themselves in North America and Europe, and they scrutinized experimental results. So it sounds like we have... above this paragraph, we have a bunch of like theoretical information, hypotheses, some things that they're noticing, and then we see their actual research. One laboratory finding that impressed Gibling was achieved at the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory at the University of Minnesota. Okay, so this is that other purpose function question is going to be answered in this paragraph. Working in a tank, researchers there described how vegetation, in this case alfalfa sprouts that were allowed to germinate on banks, transformed a channel that flowed between multiple sandbars into one that self-organized into a single thread channel. The strength of roots of alfalfa was enough to completely change the whole pattern. That generated a meandering river with banks that migrate and are erosion resistant, Gibling says. Dalcorn built an associate professor at the University of Paris who describes himself as says Davies and Gibling have delivered more than just insight into the history of rivers. They have expanded evidence that the biotic and abiotic features of the plant influence one another. Their findings may be considered significant progress in the comprehension of one of the most critical phases in the coupling between physical and biological processes. So when I see the word critical here, it's like important or necessary. The Dalhousie University geologists aren't done. They want to explore whether any of the periodic mass extinctions experienced on Earth might have affected the shapes of rivers as well. They're scouring the literature for changes preserved from the end of the Permian. Okay, so we know we were asked about something on the Permian, when a lot of plant life was wiped out. We'll look to see if rivers reverted to the older form. Okay, so we found some places that we know we're going to have answer choices. We talked about the purpose function, that now they're introducing the specific experiment. So let's go to answer questions. All right, number 22, the primary purpose of the passage. All right, so This word evaluate tends to mean that we're giving value to something or saying if it's good or bad. Very rarely do science pieces do that, and we're definitely not looking at the outcomes of a study that appear to synthesize two competing explanations. The whole explanation is that plant roots affect how rivers flow, so we can get rid of that one. Describe recent findings that support a long-standing hypothesis about the impact of plants on river formation. So that's exactly what we saw. We talked about this idea that plants affect how rivers form, and then we look at recent findings from Minnesota and the other place that kind of support that. So B feels like a pretty good option. Identify the effects of groundbreaking research on the development of a new theory. Okay, it's not a new theory. We're trying to support an existing theory, so C is incorrect. Explain field research that appeared to conflict with lab results of the experiments exploring ways in which plants change the landscape. So we saw that they went into field research in North America and Europe. They went themselves, and then we saw that experiment in the lab, and they actually complemented each other. They said the same thing. So these do not conflict. D is incorrect, so now B is the correct answer. Looking at number 23, which statement best describes the reasoning that Davies and Gibling used to reach their main conclusion? So their main conclusion was this idea that the plants were enough to kind of reshape the land. So the reshaping of rivers preceded or came before the appearance of rooted vegetables. That's not what they found. They found that rivers looked the same everywhere. It even said whether it was a temperate, arid, or polar climate, it didn't matter until rooted vegetation came around, and that's what changed rivers. All right, rivers change shape regularly in the present with no evidence that they did not do so in the past. So rivers likely did change shape in the past. Okay, that's true, but this doesn't talk about vegetation, which was kind of their main point. So most likely it's going to be incorrect, but let's see if we can disprove it further. The appearance of rooted vegetation and the reshaping of rivers occurred around the same time in the past, and rooted vegetation can be shown to cause changes to river shapes, so it likely did reshape the rivers. So this kind of covers all of our bases, the fact that we saw it in the past and then they were able to replicate it also in the lab. D says, while there is no direct evidence that rooted vegetation existed in the past, that's already incorrect. There is evidence of an effect of this type of vegetation, so it likely did exist. So we do see that evidence in the past, so D is incorrect. So that leaves us with C as our correct answer because B just leaves too much to be desired. All right, which choice provides best evidence for the idea that plants can affect the lateral pattern of flowing water? Okay, so we need to see that the river laterally has changed, so not just the flow internally or the depth. So let's look at A, 14 through 17. So starting here and then through 17, when the pair compared a much improved plant fossil record with the evidence of how rivers changed very long ago, the transition matched up. Well, this does discuss rivers and vegetation, but not specifically that lateral movement. So let's see if we can find a better option. 30 through 32. There is probably nowhere on Earth where rivers form the way they did before vegetation. Okay, that doesn't say anything about the lateral movement either, though it does talk about rivers and vegetation, not necessarily the cause or the lateral pattern. So let's try 54 through 56. There's also variation that appeared to be related to the local climate during the times that the rivers flowed. Okay, so we see a change, but we don't necessarily know that that's about vegetation. So let's see what D is offering us. 68 through 73. All right, 68. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, here we go. Working in a tank, researchers there described how vegetation, in this case alfalfa, transformed a channel that flowed between multiple sandbars into one that self-organized into a single thread channel. So we had one that had like multiple kind of like fingerlings of rivers, and then we got the vegetation made it flow into one single thread channel. So that is our answer. It talks about how water changes the lateral makeup of the river. So 24 is going to be D. All right, 25 is an inference, and has a COE follow-up, so let's see what we're looking for in that line of evidence. There is a relationship between the presence of plants rooted near rivers and which characteristics of that river. So we need to look for this relationship between rooted plants, and some other characteristic. So let's take a look, starting with 18 and 19. Okay. As soon as the plants got a foothold on the land and rooted vegetation started, that changed the landscape. So, but it doesn't say what it changed about the landscape, so we don't see a specific characteristic. So it's probably not A. Lines 33 through 35 says, at the time separating the Silurian and Devonian periods, some 420 million years ago, the picture found in preserved sedimentary rocks changes. Okay, so that is the picture in the rocks, but it doesn't necessarily talk about a connection between rooted plants and the characteristic of a river, so we can get rid of that one. 37 through 39. Okay, it happens just as evidence of land vegetation with root systems also expands in the rock record. Okay, so that does talk about root systems. What is it? We need to go up. The blankets of unconsolidated sediments found in earlier river deposits appear less frequently. So that doesn't really talk about a characteristic of the river. It talks about the sediment deposits. So let's check D, which is 40 through 44. Okay. In addition, more complex and diverse river remains emerge, including more traces of mud, probably due to the enhanced chemical weathering that plants assist, smaller sized sand grains, and samples of organic remains. So we have more mud, more sand grains, and more organic remains. So that is a characteristic of the river itself. So D is going to be the answer for 26. And looking at that presence of sediment, let's see what our answer is for 25. So the size and composition of particles, smaller sand, more mud, all those things. So A might be our answer. The color of preserved rocks, no. The temperature, we never learned about temperature. The distance they cover from source to sea, we don't talk about that. So A is our answer. 27, we talked about the word emerge as becoming present. We wrote down to show up, and so we're kind of starting to notice these things. So it is, it's not necessarily rising to the physical surface, so this word rise is going to be problematic. It's not proceeding forward in a lineup, but it is showing up, so it is kind of appear. And even though we're talking about river, it's not that these items are flowing through the river. We're seeing evidence appear, so C. All right, the main function of the 11th paragraph, this is when we learn about the specific research that they are doing. So describe how they gather their data. Yes, it says that they go across Europe and America and some other places, so that could be it. Restate their central claim. No, we're seeing their exact process. Illustrate how Davies and Gibling's findings were received. No, because we don't see their findings yet, just how they collected their data. Highlight difficulties that they encountered. We don't see any difficulties. Again, it just says how they collect their data. So A is our correct answer. For 29, purpose function, the discussion of the research at the University of Minnesota, let's go remind ourselves of what that is because we kind of breezed through it. We saw Minnesota pop up down here. Okay, so let's see. Move this box. Okay, so sorry, up here. One lab finding that impressed Gibling was achieved at the St. Anthony Falls lab at the University of Minnesota. So let's see why it's important. What do we notice here? Working in a tank, researchers there described how vegetation, the alfalfa sprouts, transformed a channel that flowed between multiple sandbars into one. So this is a lab finding that proves what they thought they were going to find in the history of the earth. And so it kind of proves that this is how those rivers could have formed. The strength of just roots of alfalfa, which like alfalfa is like, it's the same thing as chia pets basically. Alfalfa sprouts are pretty small. Generated a meandering river with banks that migrate and are erosion resistant. Okay, so let's take a look at the answer choices. Okay, so they discussed the research in order to show that Davies and Gibling were able to replicate their field observations in a controlled setting. They did do that, but I don't think that's necessarily the point. Summarize the lab finding that led to propose their theory. No, they're trying to prove a theory that they had already proposed. Describe how other researchers have tested and confirmed their hypotheses. No, this was still part of their experimentation. Highlight the results of an experiment that supports the claim made by Davies and Gibling. So this is exactly what they're looking at. They're looking at historical information, and then they're trying to replicate that information in lab work, which they did successfully. All right. 2 more, and then we're done with this first natural science passage. So critical, we talked about this thing being important or necessary, and look, important is even one of our answers. Let's go through and disprove everything else. It's not critical condition. We're not using this as in a negative connotation. Again, not critical care, it's not urgent, and we're not analyzing information. It just really matters that this thing happens. So just important. Last one. Which finding about rivers from the end of the Permian period, if true, would best support Davies and Gibling's argument? So let's go back and find where we read about the Permian period. Okay, so this is down here. All right, the Duluth University geologists aren't done. They want to explore whether any of the periodic mass extinctions experienced on Earth might have affected the shapes of the rivers as well. They are scouring the literature for changes preserved from the end of the Permian when a lot of plant life was wiped out. So lots of plant life was wiped out, and we're looking for this connection on whether any of the periodic mass extinction might have affected the shapes of rivers. So we need to see something about the shapes of rivers and mass extinction. Okay, so it would support it if they often flowed through areas containing very little rooted vegetation. All right, well, we're not talking about rooted vegetation here. We're looking at that mass extinction. They were generally shallow, wide, and contained relatively little mud. Okay, so all that is information that we had from before. So before rooted vegetation, this is what the rivers looked like, but after rooted vegetation, it didn't. So that might actually help us prove their point. They tended to be single channel meandering rivers. So that's what happens after rooted vegetation happens. So that would disprove their argument. They characteristically displayed extensive lateral accretion. So that's not something that was discussed very deeply. This is the only thing that would coincide with that rooted vegetation and how it affects rivers, and therefore the information from the Permian period would agree with that. All right, because that would be before plants existed. If everything has experienced mass extinction, then it would be as though those plants didn't exist, and it would revert back to the river's original shape. All right, so that is that first natural science. We know that we already had a social science, which means our next passage is going to be global conversation, but not paired. All right, so let's take a look at this this piece, number 32 through 41. So interesting because it looks like a social science. So we had that piece earlier that identified as a social piece as well. So let's take a look at that just to ensure that we have not made any mistakes. So 2011 and 1980. But you know what? It is about government. So I think we misidentified this one as, because of the date. So that's a really tricky thing. We still navigated it okay. Like thinking back on it, it is definitely more persuasive. So that is something good to know. These newer tests are definitely throwing a few more curveballs. So we just have to be able to navigate those. Still, this is social science. It does have a graph, so it is going to be informative. Adapted from Tetlock and Gardner's Super Forecasting, so that sounds like it's going to be about weather. The art and science of prediction. So maybe not predicting weather, but predicting something. Again, written in 2015. This would be, because it's informative and it has a graph, if you wanted to eject cord this one, that would be fine. We didn't have a graph on the last passage, so that means the next one will have a graph as well. So you could either save this one for last and go ahead and move on to natural science, or do this one with the full protocol and save the next one. All right, the main purpose of the passage. So good main idea, primary purpose question to start us out with, followed up by a COE. No need to worry about what this is asking. We have the word implies, so an inference and suggestion. Notice that I'm not reading the full question on these. I'm trying to find those key words, and then I'm going to see if I even need to read the question yet. So the next one is a word in context, not a COE follow-up. So I do need to know what this one is asking about. So it implies that probabilistic thinking did not become useful until. So basically, when did it become useful? Line 35, a word in context, 36 and 37, delivers. So we have this used twice. 36, and then again in 37. All right, the phrase cognitive cost conveys a sense of. So this isn't necessarily a word in context question. It kind of feels like a purpose function question. But it's the sense of, it's almost kind of a hybrid. So on test day, I would just do this. We want to practice for perfection, but on test day, we want to be adaptable. We know we're being asked about a term and kind of the meaning or the feeling behind that term. But it is kind of like, why did he use it? He used it to convey a sense of this in particular. So I think you can navigate these from both directions. So let's bracket line 45 through 46. And I'm going to underline cognitive cost because I know that that's really the focus. All right, 37, according to the passage. So ACC is always a CNC. Let's see if this has a COE follow-up. It does not. So let's identify some information to look for. Which choice best states the relationship between confidence level of someone providing a judgment and the accuracy of that judgment? So confidence of the judgment versus accuracy of the judgment. What is that relationship? Next question, the author's main purpose in citing the study in the last passage is to. So purpose function question, and we're looking at the last sentence. So the last sentence starts up here. So I know this whole area is going to be part of a purpose function question. Then we have graphs. So we know once we have one graph, everything else is a graph as well. So we don't need to pre-read these. It is nice that this one does have a COE follow-up, so that's going to be helpful. All right, so let's take a read. We know that we're going to be looking for probabilistic thinking and when it became useful. We're going to stop at the word delivers. We're going to stop at this idea of cognitive cost. And we're going to look at a relationship between confidence level of a judgment and accuracy of that judgment. And then the last sentence as well. Okay. Human beings have coped with uncertainty for as long as we have been recognizably human. And for almost all that time, we didn't have access to statistical models of uncertainty because they didn't exist. It was remarkably late in history, arguably as late as the 1713 publication of Jacob Bernoulli's Ars Conjectandi, before the best minds started to think seriously about probability. Before that, so before 1713 when we thought about this, people had no choice but to rely on the tip of your nose perspective. You see a shadow moving in the long grass, should you worry about lions? You try to think of an example of a lion attacking from the long grass. If the example comes to mind easily, run. If the response is strong enough, it can produce a binary conclusion. Yes, it's a lion, or no, it's not a lion. But if it's weaker, it can produce an unsettling middle probability. Maybe it's a lion? What the tip of your nose perspective will not deliver is a judgment so fine-grained that it can distinguish between, say, a 60% chance that it's a lion and an 80% chance that it's a lion. That takes slow, conscious, careful thought. Of course, when you're dealing with the pressing existential problems our ancestors faced, it was rarely necessary to make such fine distinctions. It may not even have been desirable. A 3-setting dial gives quick, clear directions. Is that a lion? Yes, run. Maybe, stay alert. No, relax. The ability to distinguish between a 60% probability and 80% probability would add little. In fact, a more fine-grained analysis could slow you down and get you killed. Okay, so this is this idea of probability. So probability became important kind of like after we were not worried about being eaten by lions, because when we were worried about being eaten by lions, probability could have been actually problematic, okay? In this light, the preference for 2 and 3 setting mental dials makes sense, and lots of research underscores the point. Why is a decline from 5% to 0 so much more valuable than a decline from 10% to 5? Because it delivers or provides or brings with it more than a 5% reduction in risk. It provides certainty. So I'm going to write the word provides because I feel like that worked in both situations. Both 0% and 100% weigh far more heavily on our minds than the mathematical models of economics say they should. Again, this is not surprising if you think about the world in which our brain evolved. There was always at least a tiny chance a lion was lurking in the vicinity, or a snake, or any of the countless other threats people faced. But our ancestors couldn't maintain a state of constant alert. The cognitive cost would have been too great. So I think that cognitive cost is like the cost of our brain power focusing on this constant alert. So it goes on to say they needed worry-free zones. The solution was to ignore small chances and use the 2 setting dial as much as possible. So it would take too much brain power. It would be exhausting. It would not be worth it in the end to be constantly on alert. So this yes or no setting was going to be helpful. Either it is a lion or it isn't. Only when something undeniably falls between those 2 settings, only when we are compelled, do we turn the mental dial to the maybe. We want answers. A confident yes or no is satisfying in a way that maybe never is. In fact, that helps to explain why the media so often turn to hedgehogs, single-minded people, who are sure they know what is coming no matter how bad their forecasting may be. So I think this might be the confidence versus judgment that we're about to learn. Of course, it's not always wrong to prefer a confident judgment, so there's even those 2 words together. All else being equal, our answers to questions like, does France have more people than Italy, are likelier to be right when we are confident they are right than when we are not. Okay, so there's that relationship. Confidence and accuracy are positively correlated. But research shows we exaggerate the size of the correlation. For instance, people trust more confident financial advisors over those who are less confident, even when their track records are identical. So even when they're doing the same level of work, we trust the confident individual. And people equate confidence and competence or ability to do things correctly, which makes the forecaster who says something has a middling probability of happening less worthy of respect. As one study noted, people took such judgments as indications of the forecasters were either generally incompetent, ignorant of the facts in a given case, or lazy, unwilling to expend the effort required to gather information that would justify greater confidence. So we see this moderate judgment as lazy, and that's going to come up in our purpose function question. Okay, the main purpose of the passage is to criticize unreasonable expectations. There's not really a critique, so we can get rid of that. We do talk about this idea that like confidence is going to affect our expectations, but that's only in this last part. So it's not really unreasonable and we're not criticizing it. Contrast the behaviors of ancient and modern societies. That does kind of come up in the beginning, but it's not really about societies, it's about individuals, and that's not the main focus of the entire passage. Offer an alternative explanation for an uncommon phenomenon. It doesn't seem uncommon, and there doesn't seem to be an alternative explanation. Place a human tendency within an evolutionary context. So this idea of being confident in your judgment and how that is kind of influenced by how our brains developed in the lion or no lion situation. Which choice provides the best supports the idea that reassurance provided by binary options, the yes or no, extends beyond matters of personal safety. I wonder if that's going to be from that discussion of our confidence in financial advisors, but let's take a look. So 22 through 25. Of course, when you are dealing with the pressing existential problems our ancestors faced, it was rarely necessary to make such a fine distinction. Well, that is the lion situation, so we're looking for something other than personal safety. 39 through 41. Again, this is not surprising if you think about the world in which our brains evolved. That's still the lion situation, so it's probably not that. 49 through 51. Only when something undeniably falls between those 2 settings, only when we are compelled, do we turn the mental dial to maybe? So that doesn't talk about our personal safety, but it also doesn't talk about anything not our personal safety. It just talks about the idea that there is a time for that middle. So hopefully D is correct. Let's take a look. 52 through 57. And look, this is when we talk about this financial forecasters. We want answers. A confident yes or no is satisfying in a way that maybe never is. A fact that helps to explain why the media so often turn to hedgehogs, single-minded people who are sure they know what is coming no matter how bad their forecasting records may be. So that is that we want that confident yes or confident no, and that's why the media hires people that can do that. All right, number 34, an inference about probabilistic thinking became useful when. We talked about that over here when we discussed that we didn't use probabilistic thinking until about 1713, because before that, we needed that binary, is it a lion or is it not a lion? So they did not become useful until the problem of daily survival became less pressing. Okay, so we can worry more about that middling when we're not being worried about being eaten by a lion, so maybe A. Until sophisticated technology was devised that was able to provide fine measurements. No, it's not about the technology. I don't know that they had a lot of that in 1713. Not until people realized it could be used to enhance common defensive maneuvers. We don't really learn about that. It does say that a maybe would be a stay alert in the lion situation, but it doesn't talk about defensive maneuvers based on that. Did not become useful until assessing the confidence levels of others became important. Again, no, it is this idea that once we were no longer worried about being hunted down by lions, we can look into that middle ground a little bit more deeply. All right, for number 35, we talked about the word provides in relationship to delivers. And look, it is one of our options. So we'll take a look at the others. It is not, this idea is not surrendering information or releasing information. It's not transporting information from one brain to another, so it is just providing that distinction. Okay, number 36, the phrase cognitive cost. We talked about this up there. The brain power required to be on constant alert would be too great. We would get burnt out. So A looks pretty good. Mental toll of continual uneasiness, that being on constant alert. Physical damage caused by ongoing attacks. Again, no, cognition is in your brain. It is the process of thinking, so it's not physical damage. Intellectual challenge of solving difficult puzzles. It's not a difficult puzzle. It's just the am I in danger or no. Grave consequences of sudden decisions. So this is actually kind of operating on the idea of being exhausted by needing to make sudden decisions. So A is our answer. Number 37, the relationship between confidence level of a judgment and the accuracy. We saw right here that confidence and accuracy are positively correlated. So as one goes up, the other goes up, but not as much as we think. We exaggerate that correlation. So the greater the confidence level, the less accurate. So that is opposite of what we're saying. The greater the confidence level, the more likely people are to scrutinize the accuracy of that judgment. Note, people trust the confident. The greater the confidence level, the more accurate that judgment will be to a certain point. So that's the important distinction. That kind of goes along with researchers show we exaggerate it. So there is a correlation, but it's only up to a certain point. So C looks pretty good. The greater the confidence level of someone providing a judgment, the more accurate that judgment will nearly always be. Okay, so that also feels right, but this certain point is more accurate to this exaggeration than the nearly always be. So even though it says nearly, that always is still problematic. So it is C. All right, the author's main purpose in citing the study in the last sentence. So let's reread that just to be safe. So this says, as one study noted, people took such judgments as indications the forecasters were either generally incompetent, ignorant of the facts in a given case, or lazy. So this is that middle of the road judgment. When we see that middle of the road, we give this negative connotation to it. We think that people are not doing their job or they don't have all the information. All right, offer quotations from subjects that appear to contradict some of the ideas discussed. This actually backs up what we just learned, that middle of the road judgments don't seem as strong to us as the yes or no's, the really confident ones. Note several irrational conclusions subjects have reached. Okay, they're not irrational. Compare contemporary subjects with the ancient humans described in the passage? No. Suggest how economic forecasters can use information provided in the passage to improve their reputations. So it wasn't about reputation. So now we need to go back. We missed something. Okay, note several irrational conclusions subjects have reached. So let's go back because there was a list. Was the list irrational? We see people that take these middle-of-the-road examples and see them as incompetent, ignorant of facts, or unwilling to expand the effort. That's not necessarily true. It just means that they are not going to confidently say yes or no because they see enough information that could provide that middle ground. So they actually are taking more information into their understanding in order to say, I can't confidently say yes or no because there's all this maybe in the middle. So that takes us back to B being the correct answer. So let's talk about the graph. According to the graph, which choice represents the number of forecasts made by forecaster P that predicted a stock price had a 50% probability of increasing? So we need forecaster P, so lighter, and 50%, so it looks like that hits the 10 bar. Because the 50 is down here in percentage, so we just see where they meet. C is 10. That is one of our options. There we go. All right, based on the graph and the passage, people would most likely follow the advice of which forecaster? So we know that we're looking for someone that is confident regardless of their track record. So let's try to find something that matches up with that. 18 through 21 says, what the tip of your nose perspective will not deliver is a judgment so fine-grained that it can distinguish between a 60% chance and an 80% chance. All right, so that doesn't give us any information about forecasters, so we can get rid of that one. We kind of know that the forecasters are near the end, so if you're in a time crunch, I would suggest starting from the bottom and moving up because it's probably going to be one of these last two answers just based on where we know the forecasters are discussed. Let's check 28 and 29 just to be safe, though. All right, the ability to distinguish between a 60% probability and an 80% would add very little. This is still that lion conversation, so again, we knew they weren't talked about here, but we just have to double check. 63 through 64. Confidence and accuracy are positively correlated, but researchers show the correlation that we exaggerated. For instance, people trust more confident financial advisors over those who are less confident, even when their track records are identical. So that's the exact quote that we were kind of thinking we might find. So that looks good. Oh, but you know what? We read too far. We read halfway through this next quote. So let's make sure that we know where this one stops and this one starts. This one stops at 64, and then we'll pick up again at 67. So let's look at that one more time. Okay, so ending in 64 with correlation. Confidence and accuracy are positively correlated, but research shows we exaggerate the size of that correlation. So that's option C. And then starting in 67, and people equate confidence and competence, which makes the forecaster who says something has a middling probability of happening less worthy. So that's D, and that's talking about the middles, and this is talking about the extremes and the confident. So let's reread our question. Most likely to follow the advice of which? So we know we follow those more confident, not the middling, and so C is our answer choice. Okay, so now we have to look at the more confident forecaster, see what they say. All right, so number of forecasts for Q is really high when he is 0% and really high when he is 100%, but pretty low when he's middling. Forecaster P seems to be the opposite. It's more even, but there's much less confidence. So let's take a look and see if we can find an answer that matches up with that. Okay, so we know that it's going to be forecaster Q because that is the more confident person, so we can get rid of C and D. So forecaster Q, because his or her predictions prove to be more accurate, it's not necessarily about the accuracy. We're looking for the confidence. Forecaster Q, because his or her predictions offered a greater certainty, so that 0 or that 100. So B is our correct answer. All right, so that is the social science. We're going to move on to the natural science.